So is everyone in their lazy boy recliners and y'all are ready to go, right? All right, we're going to talk about chapter 4. I'm going to talk in a Louisiana accent today. Just kidding. Introduction to Active Directory and Account Manager. We're going to talk about Active Directory today, if you didn't know. We're going to talk about how to install and configure Active Directory, implement Active Directory containers, such as OUs. We're going to create user accounts. We're going to configure user and security groups. We're going to describe and implement new Active Directory features. What is Active Directory? Basically, it's a repository of every asset, every resource, such as servers, printers, network users, accounts, groups, security policies, all in one location. It's just a repository. It's a bucket. Okay. That bucket is called a directory service. It's responsible to provide a central listing of all those, basically a table of contents, if you will, to quickly find and access specific resources to provide a way to manage those network resources. Who has access to what? Do you have the need to know? Do you have the right credentials? So forth, so on. Windows Server 2K8 uses Active Directory to manage the accounts. There are two different types of servers, as we discussed earlier. We have the domain controllers and we have member servers, right? Domain controller. Those are servers that have Active Directory services installed. And that are able, or they contain writable copies of Active Directory. Member servers are servers that are network managed by Active Directory and do not have Active Directory installed. So simple. What's the difference between a DC and a member server, Cameron? What's the basic underlying factor? Come on.
I'm trying so hard.
It's easy.
No, to make sure servers they have Active Directory on it, and then member servers are just, the servers. They don't have
That's it. Member servers don't have Active Directory. Domain controllers have Active Directory. That's it.
It's like the central server.
That's it. The domain controller is the boss. It's like the woman in the household. All right? You like my analogies. I keep them going, right? I just did a bunch of those analogies in wireless. They're the ones that say who does what, where, when, why, how, and who gets those extra mashed potatoes with the fried chicken on Sunday morning.
That's funny. That's what I had for dinner today, actually.
No puns intended. Domain. What is a domain? Domain is simple, just a container. It's a smaller bucket inside the big bucket. It's a container that fills all the network resources that are grouped together. Okay? It's what houses them. This room is a container inside of the bigger domain or the Active Directory, which would be rows. This building would be business.rows. This room would be 215 or 214.rows. Or 214.business.rows. Does that make sense? This is a container within a container. And then what it does is every resource is called an object. So this container is an object. Y'all with me? All right. Multi-master replication. Each domain controller is equal to every other domain controller that is in range of that Active Directory, that composes of Active Directory. What that means, in simple terms, that if Brittany's an Active Directory, Cole's Active Directory, and Jordan's Active Directory, they all can talk because they're all Active Directory. They're all on the same level. They can replicate to each other their objects inside of it. So when you have two companies like Contoso and Microsoft, or let me think of something different, like American Airlines and United Airlines, or U.S. Airways. Those were the two that merged, right?
I think so.
Or Continental and United. Okay, I know those merged. So you'd have United.com and Continental.com. Well, both of them have an Active Directory domain, right? Well, when you merge them together, they can pull all those resources over into United.com because now everything's under United. Make sense? An Active Directory server or group can house all these objects: people, printers, computers, servers, plotters, you name it. Okay? All in this central database. Remember, an Active Directory is just a logical view, is just a table of contents of everything that's in your group. All your network resources together. That's all it is, simply put. What we call Active Directory schema. What is a schema? It'll define the objects and the information pertaining to those objects that can be stored in an Active Directory. For example, a user account. One class of an object in Active Directory is defined through the schema elements unique to that class. In other words, an administrator has a specific schema. A typical domain user has a specific schema. Does that make sense? The schemas can be all this. User account, have an object name, its ID, its required attributes would be here. Login name, full name, password, and domain. Optionals, all this, has syntax and parents. All these are part of the schema that define that object. Does that make sense? Global catalog. It stores information of everything that's in the forest. What is a forest? It's a collection of multiple domains. Okay? It will store a full replica of every object within its own domain and partial replica of each object within every domain in the forest. The first domain controller figured in a forest becomes the global catalog server. So when you first install Active Directory, your first DC, your primary domain controller, will be your forest domain controller. Everything below it will be adding a new domain controller into that forest, into an existing forest. Does that make sense? So everything that's in your root domain controller will be there, but if you add something down here, it'll take part of that and store it up here so that it can still be seen all the way over here on this tree. The global catalog server provides the following. It allows people to log on to authenticate. Provides lookup and access for all the resources so that if you are trying to reach something on a subdomain in the other part, you'll have access to it. Provides replication of a key Active Directory elements and keeps copy of the most used attributes for each object for quick access. In other words, if email address is probably one of the most commonly used objects for a user account. Why? If you're on a domain, don't you pretty much have an email address attached to you? An email alias, right? That's going to be one of them. That and their logon name are going to be the two most vital pieces of information that it will hold. All right. Namespace, an Active Directory domain namespace, or domain name system, DNS. DNS has to be installed with Active Directory. Why? Why would you think it had to be installed?
Well, if you're using Active Directory, you have domains, and you have to have a DNS server to that.
Yeah, but why?
Find the other domains. Or
Think about NetBIOS. Every object has a name, right? So you've got to identify a name to an IP address. So what we have is a namespace. Because every item in that domain is part of that namespace. For example, each one of these computers, let's say the computer number on there, like this is 16. So if I really wanted to find this computer, it could be 16.16 bs214 dot rose dot ok dot or cc.ok.us or whatever the whatever the full domain is, and it will allow me direct access to that computer. Because this is in the Oklahoma higher ed's system. Does that make sense? Rose is underneath the Oklahoma higher education system. So if you go to rose.edu, it forwards to the domain name to the actual domain name, which is really from Oklahoma higher education. All right. Active Directory depends on one or more DNS servers. It has two different types of namespaces, contiguous and disjointed. Active Directory is basically a tree-like structure. It has hierarchical elements called containers. And they include forest, trees, domains, and OUs, and then sites. Forest is your top level, and as you go all the way down, sites is your lowest level. All right. So here's what you'd see. This right here, the forest, would have been Oklahoma higher education. Your tree would be Rose. Your domain would be, let's just call it Oasis. Okay. Under Oasis, you could have hr.oasis. You could have billing.oasis. You could have finance.oasis. Whatever department. Does that make sense? And then that's how you do it. But you notice over here, Site C, you have this domain pointing over here to this OU. Doesn't that look a little strange? Because they didn't put that right there like it should be. But let's just say this is in the B. B or C could actually come to this. That would be true because that would be transitive trust, but we'll get to that later on. Forest. It consists of one or more Active Directory trees that are common in a relationship. A forest can use a disjointed namespace, meaning that I don't have to use the same namespace for two. And I have two different namespaces. All trees use the same schema. All trees use the same global catalog because the tree is underneath that forest. That make sense? Global catalog would be in the forest. Domains enable administrator of commonly associated objects such as accounts and other resources within that forest. Two-way transitive trusts are automatically configured between the domains within a single forest. So long as I'm within that forest, I have transitive trust anywhere in that forest. Forest provides a means to relate trees that use contiguous namespace and domains within each tree. The advantage of joining trees to a forest is that all domains share the same schema and global catalog. Forest functional level. You want to only go up your functional level when you install Active Directory. It'll ask you for your functional level. You only want to go up to the highest level of which your lowest domain controller is. So, for instance, you have a 2008 R2, a 2008, and a 2003 R2 domain controllers. The highest first functional level you want to do is a 2003 R2. Why? Because if you do 2008, you've knocked out your 2003. It won't talk. You'd have to promote your 2003 R2 to a 2008 for it to work. Does that make sense? When I was talking about disjointed namespace, here's disjointed namespaces. It's all off of here. Here's your global catalog, but I can have other namespaces, and then I can have sub namespaces all of them. All right. The forest, 2008 will go back all the way down to 2000 native. You can have 2003 or 2008. What's a tree? What do you think a tree is? It's just a hierarchical namespace underneath the forest. Okay? The domains within a tree are what we call a Kerberos transitive trust relationship, which give you a two-way trust between the parent and child domains only. All right? So that's what a tree is. Domain. The domain is a logical partition within an Active Directory forest. It's just a grouping of objects, like I talked about, just that bucket or that container, that have some sort of common relationship. Okay? And it helps to manage your resources. How'd you like to have a network like that? See, what is that? 8 Active Directory domains for South Carolina and 8 in Japan. It's plausible.
I wouldn't want to be the only network guy working.
Be doing a lot of traveling.
Yeah.
1 week Japan, 1 week South Carolina, 1 week Japan. Domain functional levels refers to Windows Server operating system. And like I said, your domain functional level, you only want to go to the highest functional level of your lowest domain controller. I can't say that enough. Organizational unit. It just gives you a way to hide or to organize groups, users, printers. It's basically a folder, if you will, to hold objects. Okay. You know, you can group it down to like HR, accounting, whatever. OUs are what you apply group policies against. All right. You'll need to know that when we start talking about group policy. When you plan to create OUs, keep 3 concerns in mind. You want to limit OUs to 10 levels or fewer. Cameron.
It's quiet about it.
You started it. And then
You're saying I started it?
Cole did, and then you, and then me, and then Cameron. Like, this is ridiculous.
And Anthony's back here just trying to hold it in. Jordan, I blame you from last class. Okay, it's the lights.
We need to turn them back on.
No. Active Directory works more effectively when OUs are set up horizontally instead of vertically.
You want us to fall asleep in your class.
No, it was bad enough I nearly fell asleep in my own class last night while giving my own lecture. So, Anthony, you were in there.
Yeah.
You could tell it, couldn't you?
Yeah.
I just started going, yeah. Anyway, the creation of OUs involves more processing resources because each request through an OU requires CPU time. So the more OUs that you do, the more CPU time you're going to take to validate. The CPUs are fast enough that you really don't care. Jiminy Christmas. A site. Y'all gonna put me to sleep tonight. A TCP/IP based concept within an Active Directory that is linked to IP subnets. Okay, a site is a group of computers. Like this room would be a subnet. We can set this as a site. based on connectivity or replication functions. Bridgehead server, domain controllers that is designated to have the role of exchanging replication information. The bridgehead is the one that connects to the other bridgehead servers. That's all it does. Above all, Active Directory, keep it as simple as possible. Kiss it. I don't mean literally. You want to logically plan your structure out before you implement it, and do it with the least amount of domains as possible. Implement only one domain on the most small networks. Don't build Active Directory with more than 10 levels of OUs. Use domains as partitions and forests to demarcate commonly associated accounts and resources governed by group and security policies. Implement multiple trees and forests only as necessary. Use sites in situations where there are multiple IP subnets and multiple geographic locations. User account management. By default, on every Windows system, you have an administrator and a guest account. On a Windows server, if I ever catch any of you in my class ever leaving the defaults on, you will fail my class. Once you log in, you're to rename these accounts, create you a new administrator account, rename both of these, and disable them. Okay? Creating accounts when Active Directory is not installed, you got to go into the MMC snap-in. You start run MMC. You add local users and groups, click add. Add in the user. You can change that and then click create. Or if Active Directory is installed, if you want to go under users and groups, you can do it this way too. Once it's created, you can go into properties and change all these, change the member of. All right, one of the best ways to manage accounts is by grouping them into a group. Okay, that makes security a lot easier. Instead of applying 5 different, having to go through each one of you to apply a security measure, if I put you all as a group of students and I apply a set of security to the students group, you all get those security credentials at the same time. So it makes it a lot easier to manage. There are 4 types of groups. You have local, domain local, global, and universal. You're always going to want to use a global group. And you're also always going to want to use a security group. Distribution groups are basically for Exchange servers. If you're going to deal with Exchange, they're for emails, phone numbers, contacts, things like that. Security group are going to be for your accessing files and resources. So you're always going to want a global security group. Your local security group can be used to manage resources on a standalone computer, but it's not a part of the domain. Domain local is when Active Directory is specific to the domain controller itself. Membership capabilities, you can look this up on table 4.1 in your book. Global security group. Now this allows you to be a member of a domain local group in your domain and everywhere else. It can contain user accounts and other global groups from the domain in which it was created, and it can be converted to a universal group as long as it's not nested in another global group or in another universal group. Okay? So here's what you want to do. If I'm looking at as far as implementing groups, have my managers to be able to see all, then my finance see smaller, and then the budget see smaller. Does it make sense? Need to know. Typical use for a global group is to build it with accounts that need access to the resources in the same or in another domain. Just keep in mind, what do you want them to see? your college.edu, you'll have your local exec domains, then you'll have a global exec group. You'll have your local groups here for each, so they can only see in research and they can only see in students. But in college, these global execs can see all. A universal security group provides means to span the entire domains and trees. It can go from any domain, any group, any universal group, it doesn't matter, among all trees in a forest. All right. You really want to use them, like I said, as a global group instead of a universal. You give them universal rights, then it makes it a little harder to manage. Now, that's what happens when you give them a universal group. Which do you think is going to be better? You see the problem now? But you can create, go into any user and add them to general. You can add specific members. You can make that group a member of a certain group, and then you can say who can manage it. Local user profile, basically that's you as a user. You can go in there and change your password, change information about you, what permissions you have, and things of that nature. Inside the user profile, we can actually do what's called a roaming profile. Have you all heard that term before? Basically what a roaming profile does is it takes everything that you do on your desktop and it stores it in the memory. So anytime you go to whatever computer in that domain you log in, it actually uses that as your desktop. Okay, and then you have mandatory profiles. We can set that with group policy that it doesn't matter where you log on, you have this desktop and that's all you're going to get.
So you're saying that there's basically a checkbox in order to enable roaming profiles and whatnot?
Well, roaming profiles, all I do is just drop your name in a roaming profile box, and I'll show y'all where to do that.
Okay.
One way to set up a profile is to first set up a generic account on the server with the desired desktop configuration. Then copy that ntuser.dat file into the user's default folder. And that's it. That's how you set up your mandatory. To create the roaming profile, you'll set up a generic account, customize the desktop, set up the user's account profile by opening a profile tab in each user account properties and then entering the path to that profile. Right there. All I got to do is go in here and say, that would be right there would be, it's not really the roaming profile, but that would be the, or it could be that could be the mandatory profile if I wanted it to be. But usually I would do it as a username. Five new features. In Active Directory, you have a restart capability. You can make a read-only domain controller, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Auditing improvements, multiple password and account lockout policies in a single domain. And that'll be fun. And then we have lightweight directory access server role. So we'll talk about that. Restart capability. We can restart Active Directory without having to turn off and reboot the server. Prior to Windows 2008, if you had to restart Active Directory, it took 35 minutes to reboot the server. You made one change, 35 minutes. How much is that a nightmare? Now, all you have to do is just reboot it and instead of taking down the server and come back up. You just stop the service and restart it. Pretty simple, huh? Read-only domain controllers. You can't use it to update information, but all it does is replicate what's in the domain controller so you can see it on the non-domain controlled computers. Or, I mean, it's a domain controller, but you can see what's in Active Directory. It allows, let's say, you work for MidFirst, right, Brittany?
Yes.
Okay. Let's say MidFirst has this main downtown branch. Okay, that's where their primary domain controller is. And we have 15 sublocations outside. And each sublocation has a read-only domain controller. What that allows to happen is, if, for instance, the primary domain controller fails or goes down, the connection to the building goes down, Brittany can still log into her computer because the read-only domain controller can authenticate her because it still has those privileges there. You can't change anything on it. It's just a text file that basically says, here's who has access to this network. Does that make sense? That's what read-only domain controllers are for. And you can also make that the DNS server if you wish. Auditing improvements. Server administrators can now create an audit trail of many types of changes that might be made in Active Directory. Why would you want that? In case someone hacks you, right? You wouldn't want that audit trail to know what happened. What was the last thing that was changed? We show you how to do those. You can set it up in the domain controller's global policy to audit successful or failed Active Directory changes and actions, which you're going to do, and configure successful or failed changed actions on specific Active Directory objects or containers, which you will get to do on your hands-on final. Hint, hint, hint.
Wait, say again.
Slide 68. Hint, hint, hint. Hint, hint, hint. Do I need to say any more? Do I need to say any more? Okay. You can set up multiple password and account lockout security requirements and associate them with a specific user or group. You can also associate them with an OU by creating a global shadow security group. And that group can be mapped to any OU. Those are what we call a fine-grained password policy. All right. Lightweight Directory Services, or LDS, is targeted for servers that manage user applications. LDS is more forgiving than than Directory Services because if you make a mistake in modification, the mistake in most circumstances does not affect how the users access resources. LDS can be installed as a role. Is there any questions? Did I just fry your brain? You ready for chapter 2? And Brittany's thinking, me? Oh my.
5.
Your second chapter.
Oh, never mind. You're looking at it 1 of 2, 2 of 2. Okay. It'll be more meaningful once I actually do it.
Okay. We'll breeze through this. This is talking about file permissions, folder permissions. Set up security for folders and files. Configure shared folders and files. Do DFS, disk quotas. And I'm not going to talk about Unix capability. Okay, there's 2 different types of access control that we can configure in Microsoft. We can do discretionary access control, which is DACL, or systems control, which is SACL. An ACL is configured by the server administrator or owner of object. That's discretionary. And then system control contains information used to audit the access to an object. All right. There are 2 basic attributes that NTFS still reside from FAT, and that's read-only and hidden. All right. The rest of the attributes of the files and folders have changed. We now have advanced ones such as archive and index and compress and encrypt. Okay, so here's your the only two that you have on FAT. Here are the other 4 that you get right here on NTFS. Explain what the difference is when you see it in Windows. Archive attributes. What does that mean? It indicates whether the folder or file has been backed up and archived because it has new or changed. The file server will back up the systems and detect files that the archive bit has been checked, and then it will change it if those need to be backed up. Index attribute versus Windows Search Service. Using index allows you to find things a lot quicker than the search service, because once you index it, it's basically a table of contents saying where things are located. Index attribute, Windows Server 8 offers a newer, faster called Windows Search Service. Windows Search Service, you must install the File Services role in order to do it. Multi-master replication, we just talked about that. Active Directory is built to make replication efficient. We already talked about that. Windows Search Services, when we're talking about roles and services, we'll end up doing DFS and then Windows Search Service. But if you want to do index services, indexing is basically from 03. Search Service is 08. Notice the difference? All right, advanced options. Here's how you configure the indexing. Where am I going to select it? Where am I going to start it? Compress attribute. Basically, you're compressing all your file folder content. Do not, for your life of you, compress your NTFS directory or your WinNT directory. I had to go in after someone, to a client of mine. He called me up and said, Scott, I need you to come over. I've got a problem. I said, what's the problem? He goes, well, I can't get on my computer. Went in, booted up with Hirons, and got in and looked at it, and they had compressed his Windows directory.
How do you do that?
Right click on it and go to compress and hit OK.
Okay, then why?
To save space on a C drive, because he only had 40 gigs on his C drive.
And this is like its whole entire C drive.
He compressed it.
So be very careful when you compress things. Only compress data that needs to be compressed, not the operating system. Encrypt attribute, but if you're going to encrypt anything, you have to have EFS, or the encrypting file system, which is a role. Microsoft uses EFS, which is a unique private encryption key associated with a user account specific to your SID or your UID. And it uses both symmetric and asymmetric encryption techniques. So now how hard is that? When you move something into an encrypted file or encrypted file to another folder on the same computer, that file remains encrypted, even if you rename it.
Is that even worth mentioning?
If I have a encrypted folder,
Yeah.
and I move that file that was encrypted to another folder, prior to Windows 2K8, it would become unencrypted.
Really?
Yes. Permissions. This is not what your mom and dad told you could do when you were a kid. Control access to an object, such as a file or folder. Basically says who does what, who has the need to know to get to this information. Here's the properties on that specific object name for this folder. Here are your groups or users that can have access, and then here are the permissions they can do. We have full control, which means you're basically God. You have total access to everything on there. Modify, that's the step below. You have everything else, with the exception of special permissions. Read and execute. List folder contents, read and write, those are pretty much self-explanatory, right? Notice that list folder contents are only folders only. Why would that be? Because it says list folder objects, not list file objects. Because files don't have objects or contents. If you need to customize permissions, you have the option to set up as special permissions or for a particular user or group. Pretty simple. We discussed that. I can go into that permission entry and I can say you have full control. You can do read, write, you can append, you can do anything you want to that specific file. These are file permissions. And folder permissions. You don't see them much on folders, but they're pretty much all on files. Auditing, again, enables you to track activity on a folder or file, just like you did with earlier in Active Directory. With permissions of auditing setup, you might want to verify the ownership of the folder, figure out who has ownership of it. So when you're about to terminate, you need to change the ownership of the file in the folders. Might be a good thing. That's why you like putting everything in group instead of into an individual. A file or a folder can be set up as a shared folder for users to access across the network. In order to share across the network, you have to turn on file sharing. Duh. Right? I know you're all falling asleep. Am I that monotone tonight? File sharing, you have to turn it on by just coming in here, say who you want to share it with, and say if they're the owner, the reader, right, permissions there. Then you go into the sharing tab, go in here to sharing, set up the sharing. You can do advanced sharing, give it the permissions, go into security, change the security of who has it. Share permissions for an object differ from the NTFS access permissions set through the security tab. Remember, you have folder permissions, object permissions, and file permissions now. So you need to know all three need to be set if you're going to change anything. You can change cache. You can cache a folder to make the contents of a shared folder available offline if you want. I don't, because what's going to happen? If you get hacked, you've now given those resources to a hacker. I don't ever make anything available offline. You can publish an object, which means you put it onto the Active Directory store so that it can be used by everyone in the directory. Directory Services Client, or DS Client, basically it was allowed earlier Windows-based operating systems to search Active Directory. Windows Server 2K8 allows effective permissions tab in the folder, properties of the folder or file. It allows you to view who has permissions to this folder and what those effective permissions are. Take into account what happens when a folder and files are copied or moved. If a file that is copied from one folder or another on the same volume inherits the permissions of the folder in which it's copied. So if the folder is encrypted and you move a file into that encrypted folder, that file now becomes encrypted. A file or folder that is moved from one to another on the same volume takes with it the permissions that it had in the original folder. So if you move it from an encrypted to an unencrypted, it will stay encrypted. If you move it, if you copy it, it won't. If a folder that is moved or copied to a folder on a different volume inherits the permissions of the folder in which it's moved or copied. I'm not going to worry about that. DFS enables you to simply access shared folders across the network. You turn it on, you can turn on shares across the network. DFS advantages: shared folders can be set up so they appear in one hierarchy of folders when they could be in multiple different folders. And it allows load balancing to occur. Not going to worry about that. Standalone DFS, you don't have to have Active Directory for it, but if you do domain-based, you will have to have Active Directory, and it allows you to have implement those certain file folder permissions. DFS topology, it's a hierarchical structural DFS in the domain-based model. You'll have the namespace root, which is your top container, or your main container in your Active Directory, and it will flow down from there. Replication group is a set of shared folders that is replicated or copied one or more servers in the domain into that domain. Simple, just like we talked about replicating. I'm replicating your grade from one student to another, and everyone that yawned tonight gets an A. Faker. Installing DFS, basically you got to go through the roles and services. Do DFS namespace and replication. And then we create the folder target saying where we're going to do it. It creates a UNC. So here's the naming convention for it. Then we're going to delegate management, and involves right-clicking on the namespace, clicking delegate management permissions, tuning a namespace, and then here's your referrals, how you refer it underneath the properties, referrals tab. You can go under here and you can change the ordering. Deleting a namespace root. You can delete it by the namespace root via the DFS management tool. And then you can use replication if you wish. Disk quotas, basically, it helps you prevent your disk from getting overfilled too quickly. You can enable, say, individuals only get 1 gig of data, and get warned at 900 megabytes or whatever. And you can set it on any local or shared volume, or you can assign it to an individual too. You deny disk space to users exceeding a quota, or you can not limit disk usage. I mean, it's up to you what you want to do with it. And that's all I'm going to cover. Any questions?
Hands-on with this on Thursday, correct?
Don't know. I'm going to cover 2 more chapters.
No, that please don't do this to me.
That would not
Sad
help.
days.
You've already said you designate Thursdays as lab days, so you can't do that.
Of course, it's going to be lab day. You think I want to lecture 2 more chapters?
No.
I'll tell you what we're going to do on labs on Thursday. And we'll do this on Thursday. All right. Any other questions?
Yawn.
All right. Hit the road, Jack.